Chapter 9 Equity Theory. Equity theory is a theory of motivation that concentrates on people's perceptions of the fairness of their work outcomes relative to, or in proportion to, their work inputs. Equity theory complements expectancy and need theories by focusing on how people perceive the relationship between the outcomes they receive from their jobs and organizations and the input they contribute. Equity theory was formulated in the 1960s by J. Stacy Adams, who stressed that what is important in determining motivation is the relative rather than the absolute levels of outcomes a person receives and inputs a person contributes. Specifically, motivation is influenced by the comparison of one's own outcome-input ratio with the outcome-input ratio of a referent. The referent could be another person or a group of people who are perceived to be similar to oneself. The referent also could be oneself in a previous job or one's expectations about what outcome input ratios should be. In a comparison of one's own outcome input ratio to a reference ratio, one perception of outcome and input are key. Equity. Equity exists when a person perceives his or her own outcome input ratio to be equal to a reference outcome input ratio. Under conditions of equity, if a referent receives more outcomes than you receive, the referent contributes proportionally more inputs to the organization, so his or her outcome input ratio still equals your ratio. Maria Sanchez and Claudia King, for example, both work in a shoe store in a large mall. Sanchez is paid more per hour than King, but also contributes more inputs, including being responsible for some of the store's bookkeeping, closing the store, and periodically depositing cash in the bank. When King compares her outcome input ratio to Sanchez's, she perceives the ratios to be equitable because Sanchez's higher level of pay is proportional to her higher level of inputs. Similarly, under conditions of equity, if you receive more outcomes than a referent, your inputs are perceived to be proportionally higher. Continuing with our example, when Sanchez compares her outcome input ratio to King's ratio, she perceives them to be equitable because her higher level of pay is proportional to her higher level of inputs. When equity exists, people are motivated to continue contributing their current levels of inputs to their organizations to receive their current levels of outcome. If people wish to increase their outcomes under conditions of equity, they are motivated to increase their inputs. Inequity. Inequity or lack of fairness exists when a person's outcome input ratio is not perceived to be equal to a reference. Inequity creates pressure or tension inside people and motivates them to restore equity by bringing the two ratios back into balance. There are two types of inequity: underpayment inequity and overpayment inequity. Underpayment inequity exists when a person's own outcome input ratio is perceived to be less than that of a referent. In comparing yourself to a referent, you think you are not receiving the outcomes you should be, given your inputs. Overpayment inequity exists when a person perceives that his or her own outcome input ratio is greater than that of a referent. In comparing yourself to a referent, you think you are receiving more outcomes than you should be, given your input. Ways to restore equity. According to equity theory, both underpayment inequity and overpayment inequity create tension that motivates most people to restore equity by bringing the ratios back into balance. When people experience underpayment inequity, they may be motivated to lower their inputs by reducing their working hours, putting forth less effort on the job, or being absent, or they may be motivated to increase their outcomes by asking for a raise or a promotion. Susan Ritchie, a financial analyst at a large corporation, noticed that she was working longer hours and getting more work accomplished than a coworker who had the same position, yet they both received the exact same pay and other outcomes. To restore equity, Ritchie decided to stop coming in early and staying late. Alternatively, she could have tried to restore equity by trying to increase her outcomes, perhaps by asking her boss for a raise. When people experience underpayment inequity and other means of equity restoration fail, they can change their perception of their own or the referent's inputs or outcomes. For example, they may realize that their referent is really working on a more difficult project than they are, or that they really take more time off from work than their referent does. Alternatively, if people who feel they are underpaid have other employment options, they may leave the organization. As an example, John Steinberg, an assistant principal in a high school, experienced underpayment and equity when he realized all the other assistant principals of high schools in his school district had received promotions to the position of principal, even though they had been in their jobs for a far shorter time than he had. Steinberg's performance had always been appraised as being high, so after his repeated requests for promotions went unheeded, he found a job as a principal in a different school district. When people experience overpayment inequity, they may try to restore equity by changing their perception of their own or their referent's inputs or outcomes. Equity can be restored when people realize they are contributing more inputs than they originally thought. Equity also can be restored by perceiving the referent's inputs to be lower or the referent's outcomes to be higher than one originally thought. When equity is restored in this way, actual inputs and outcomes are unchanged, and the person being overpaid takes no real action. What has changed is how people think about or view their or the referent's inputs and outcomes. For instance, Mary McMahon experienced overpayment inequity when she realized she was being paid $2 an hour more than a coworker who had the same job as she did at a record store. McMahon restored equity by changing her perception of her inputs. She realized she was working harder than her coworker and solved more problems that came up in the store. Experiencing either overpayment or underpayment inequity, you might decide that your referent is not appropriate because, for example, the referent is too different from yourself. Choosing a more appropriate referent may bring the ratios back into balance. Angela Martinez, a middle manager in the engineering department of a chemical company, experienced overpayment inequity when she realized she was being paid quite a bit more than her friend who was a middle manager in the marketing department of the same company. After thinking about the discrepancy for a while, Martinez decided that engineering and marketing were so different that she should not be comparing her job to her friend's job, even though they were both middle managers. Martinez restored equity by changing her referent. She picked the middle manager in the engineering department as a new referent. Motivation is highest when as many people as possible in an organization perceive that they are being equitably treated, their outcomes and inputs are in balance. Top contributors and performers are motivated to continue contributing at a high level of inputs because they are receiving the outcomes they deserve. Mediocre contributors and performers realize that if they want to increase their outcomes, they have to increase their inputs. Managers of effective organizations like SAS realize the importance of equity for motivation and performance and continually strive to ensure that employees believe they are being equitably treated. The dot-com boom, its subsequent bust, and 2 recessions, along with increased global competition, have resulted in some workers putting in longer and longer work hours without any increase in their outcomes. For those referents are not experiencing a similar change, perceptions of inequity are likely. According to Jill Andreski-Fraser, author of White Collar Sweatshop, over 25 million U.S. workers work more than 49 hours per week in the office. Almost 11 million work more than 60 hours per week in the office, and many also put in additional work hours at home. Moreover, advances in information technology such as email and cell phones have resulted in work intruding on home time, vacation time, and even special occasions.